Julianne Hayes, 42, an interior designer, nervously adjusts her dress as her husband, Mark Hayes, 45, a successful venture capitalist, sits across from her. Their attorney, Lauren, a confident and attractive woman, organizes papers at the table. Julianne swallows hard, knowing that this meeting will determine the fate of her marriage. Her heart races as she prepares to confess, but there's a sinking feeling in her stomach. What if her secrets have already been exposed? The room felt colder than usual. Julianne Hayes, her fingers slightly trembling, sat across from her husband, Mark, in a sleek, minimalist conference room. The glass walls allowed a view of the busy city skyline outside, but the view felt distant, just like the man sitting across from her. Mark, dressed in a crisp suit, looked as confident as ever, his expression distant, unreadable. Julianne had never seen him so detached. Not even in the worst moments of their marriage did she feel this distance between them. It was as if an invisible wall had formed, one that she had no idea how to break down. They weren't alone. Sitting beside Mark was Lauren, their attorney, who shuffled papers with an air of professionalism that seemed almost too cold for a moment like this. Julianne's eyes flickered between them, trying to make sense of the situation. The last time she'd been in a room like this was years ago when they were negotiating a business merger. That had been easy, just numbers and figures. Now there were no figures, no deals to be made, just raw emotion and painful truths. Julianne felt herself getting lost in the silence. The heavy weight of the conversation they were about to have pressed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had never imagined this day would come, not like this. She had thought maybe, just maybe, they could work things out without everything falling apart. But she knew, deep down, that was a lie. This was the moment of truth, the moment she would have to face everything head on. Mark, however, said nothing. His eyes never left her, but there was no warmth in them. No sign of the man she had married, the man she had once loved deeply. Instead, there was only the cold gaze of a stranger. It made Julianne's stomach twist in knots. Every part of her wanted to run to escape the inevitable, but there was no escape now. The damage had already been done. Julianne Mark finally spoke, his voice steady, devoid of emotion. "Let's get this over with." The words stung more than she expected. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out at first. She had rehearsed her apology over and over in her mind, but now, in the presence of the man she had betrayed, her words felt hollow, forced. The weight of her guilt flooded her, and she knew, as soon as she spoke, everything would change. As the silence continued to stretch between them, Julianne could feel herself unraveling. Every second felt like an eternity, a slow suffocation as she desperately tried to find the words that would explain herself, to make Mark understand why she had done what she had. The affair with Jason, the 30-year-old tech entrepreneur she had met at a design conference, it was supposed to be a fleeting moment of distraction. She had convinced herself it was nothing more than a mistake, an escape from the crushing weight of her own insecurities and feelings of neglect in her marriage. But now, as she sat there, facing her husband in a sterile conference room, all of her excuses seemed weak. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a conscious decision, a betrayal that tore apart everything they had built together. Her hands shook as she gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. The guilt gnawed at her from the inside out, but there was nothing she could do to take it back. Julianne glanced at Mark again. He was still staring at her, but there was no recognition in his eyes. His gaze was empty, cold. The man who had once been her everything now felt like a distant memory. The years of their marriage seemed to fade into the background as she realized how little she knew him now, how far they had drifted apart. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to steady her breath. She wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she say? Her mind raced with self-doubt. What if this was the end of everything? What if Mark couldn't forgive her, couldn't look past the betrayal? She felt small, insignificant under his gaze. What had she become? She wasn't the woman who had promised to love him for better or for worse. She wasn't the woman who had stood beside him through thick and thin. She was someone entirely different now, someone who had shattered everything they had built together. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not now. Not in front of him. She couldn't let herself appear weak, not when she had already lost so much. The weight of what she had done, what she was about to lose, crushed her. She wanted to rewind time, to undo her mistakes, but she knew it was impossible. This was the point of no return. The pressure of the moment seemed to multiply with every passing second. Julianne opened her mouth, her voice shaky at first, as she finally began to speak. "Mark, I'm so sorry. I know this is going to hurt you, and I deserve it. I've betrayed you, and I can't undo what I've done." She started, each word dragging the weight of her guilt behind it. The truth hung in the air like a suffocating fog. She had prepared for this moment in her mind countless times, rehearsing the apology she would offer to save whatever was left of their marriage. But now, as she spoke, everything felt too little, too late. There was no magic phrase that could take away the sting of her actions. There was no way to erase the fact that she had cheated, that she had let herself be swept away by someone younger, someone who made her feel desired in a way that Mark had stopped doing. The words spilled out faster now, almost uncontrollably. "I've been going through a lot, Mark. I've been struggling. And I thought maybe if I could just find a way to feel alive again, to feel like I mattered," she faltered, her throat tight, unable to continue. She felt pathetic, weak even, as she tried to explain herself. "It was selfish. I didn't think about you, about us. All I could see was my own emptiness, my own confusion," she said, her eyes cast downward. The apology wasn't enough. She could feel the hopelessness creeping in as she realized how empty her words were. It was a mistake, a horrible mistake. "But I was in a midlife crisis, Mark. I was searching for something I thought I lost, and I made the worst choice of my life." Her voice cracked and she hated herself for it. She had always prided herself on being strong, independent, but in this moment, she felt like a shadow of the woman she once was. The words she'd hoped would bridge the gap between them only seemed to deepen the chasm. Her affair was no longer just a one-time mistake. It was a symbol of everything she had neglected, everything she had failed to see while buried in the frustrations of her own life. As she finished her apology, Julianne braced herself for Mark's reaction, feeling the heaviness of his silence more than ever. She knew he was listening, but she didn't know if he was hearing her or if he even cared anymore. Julianne's heart pounded in her chest as she finished speaking. She couldn't bear the silence any longer. Mark had been stoic throughout her apology, his eyes cold and unreadable. The man who once loved her so deeply was now a stranger, and she had no idea how to fix it. Her words felt inadequate, meaningless in the face of what she had done. She looked to Lauren, their attorney, whose face was a study in neutral professionalism. It only added to Julianne's sense of isolation, as though the world around her had become a distant, unfeeling blur. She could feel the tears welling up again, but she refused to let them fall. Not now, not in front of Mark. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "Do you think I didn't know?" Julianne, his voice was calm, too calm, like a distant storm waiting to break. Julianne's chest tightened, and she swallowed hard, trying to process what he was saying. Mark's hand slid into his coat pocket, and he pulled out a small device, something so innocuous-looking that Julianne didn't recognize it at first. It was a recording device. The blood drained from her face as her worst nightmare unfolded before her. "These," he said, his voice low and even, "are recordings. Conversations between you and Jason." Julianne froze. The world seemed to stop moving as she tried to process what he was saying. He couldn't possibly have those. How could he? Her mind raced, but no matter how hard she tried, there was no denying the reality of it. Mark had recordings, proof of the depths of her betrayal, a constant reminder of her shame. "Mark," she started, but the words failed her. She couldn't explain her actions. There was nothing she could say now. She had thought her confession was the hardest part of this meeting, but this revelation shattered everything she had believed would salvage their marriage. She had hoped that her apology might open a door for reconciliation, that maybe Mark would understand her pain, her struggle. But the recordings were undeniable evidence of her dishonesty, and the secret world she had created behind his back. Mark didn't raise his voice, didn't yell. He didn't need to. His quiet, steady words spoke volumes. Every recording, every stolen conversation, pierced through Julianne like 1,000 needles. She was trapped. There was no escape from the reality that her betrayal was far worse than she had ever imagined. As Mark played back the recordings, Julianne could feel her world crumbling. Each word from Jason, each whispered moment of intimacy that she had once believed was private, was now laid bare. The weight of the recordings was suffocating. It wasn't just about the affair anymore, it was about her deceit, her lies, the wall of mistrust she had built between them. As Mark continued to play the recordings, Julianne's heart raced, her mind spiraling out of control. Each word that echoed from the small speaker seemed to push her deeper into the pit of her own despair. She could hear Jason's voice, smooth and easy, reassuring her that everything would be okay, that she deserved to feel desired, that she wasn't just a housewife, a shadow of the woman she used to be. The familiarity of the conversations, the intimacy, was now her deepest shame. "Mark, please." Julianne's voice quivered as she tried to regain some semblance of control. "I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant for you to find out this way." Her words felt empty, like a weak attempt to patch up a gaping wound. She had no idea how to make him understand. She had hoped her apology earlier might have softened him, but now, standing before the man who had once been her partner in every sense, she realized how little she had truly acknowledged the pain she had caused him. "I didn't want this," she continued, trying to choke back the desperation rising in her chest. "I didn't want to hurt you, Mark." But her voice cracked, and she felt a tear slip down her cheek. "I was lost. I was confused. I felt invisible. You were always so distant. And Jason, he saw me. He saw me in a way you stopped seeing me a long time ago." Her eyes darted to Lauren, whose expression remained professional but sympathetic. Lauren's silence felt like an accusation. Julianne felt the need to explain herself further, to make Mark understand the tangled mess of her emotions that led to the affair. "It wasn't about Jason. It was about me. I was drowning in my own insecurities, and I thought I needed someone to pull me up. But I see now that I've only made things worse. I've destroyed everything." She stopped, breathless, feeling the weight of her own words. She could hear the hollow sound of her own voice, the broken woman she had become. The reality of the situation felt suffocating, and she couldn't tell if she was speaking to save her marriage or to save herself from the guilt that was consuming her. But no matter how hard she tried to justify her actions, no matter how much she pleaded for understanding, it was clear that her words were falling on deaf ears. Mark's cold, unwavering stare said it all. He wasn't listening to her excuses, he was simply waiting for the end of this painful ordeal. And the end, Julianne realized, was inevitable. Mark's silence was the hardest part. Every word Julianne spoke, every tear she shed, seemed to have no effect on him. He listened, but there was no change in his expression, no flicker of the man who had once been her confidant, the man who had comforted her when she was at her lowest. Instead, Mark had transformed into someone almost unrecognizable, a man detached from everything they had built together. The man who had once held her close now felt like a stranger sitting across from her, not even a hint of compassion in his eyes. He hadn't raised his voice once during the entire meeting. Julianne had expected anger, maybe even rage. She deserved it. After all, but instead, Mark had chosen to remain emotionally distant, almost mechanical. It was a chilling contrast to the passionate, loving man she had once known. Every word he spoke felt calculated, his tone as flat as the conference table between them. His eyes were steady, but they held no warmth, no love. It was as if he was already mourning the death of their marriage, but was too numb to feel anything more. Her frustration grew with each passing second. She wanted him to scream at her, to tell her how much she had hurt him. She wanted him to show some sign that he still cared. But instead, he sat there, cool and composed, as though the man he once was buried beneath layers of emotional detachment. "Do you have anything else to say?" Julianne Mark's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts, his words so measured, so calm, it felt like a slap in the face. Her chest tightened. "Mark, please," she pleaded again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to lose you. I never wanted to lose you. I was just so lost myself. I didn't know what I was doing." Mark leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. He didn't seem to be looking at her at all. He was looking beyond her, as though she had already been erased from his thoughts. "I think you already lost me," Julianne said softly, but with undeniable finality. The words hit her harder than any accusation or anger ever could. It wasn't the sharp sting of betrayal she had expected, it was the quiet, painful acceptance of something she couldn't take back. Mark had already processed everything, and his decision had been made long before this meeting had even started. The realization that he had already let go of her was the most painful part of all. Julianne sat there, her hands shaking as she tried to hold herself together. She wanted to scream, to break down, to tell him everything she was feeling. But in that moment she understood that nothing she said would change anything. It was too late. Mark's stoic demeanor was the final blow. The emotional distance between them had grown so vast that it felt impossible to bridge. Every word she spoke, every apology, every tear, it didn't matter. Their marriage was already over, and she was the one who had ended it. Julianne sat in stunned silence as Mark pulled a folder from his briefcase. Her stomach dropped as he slid the papers across the table toward her. The sound of the papers shifting across the desk echoed in the room, loud and final. She knew what it was before she even had to look at it. Divorce papers. The cold, stark reality of the situation hit her like a slap to the face. "Sign them," Julianne Mark said, his voice still composed but carrying an undercurrent of finality that made her heart ache. "There's nothing left here for us. I don't think there ever was." The words felt like a blur, the meaning of them cutting through her like a sharp blade. She stared at the papers, her mind racing, her heart heavy with regret. She had known this was coming. Deep down, she had known the moment the affair started that this would be the outcome. But knowing it and facing it were two entirely different things. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to show him any more weakness. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. She had destroyed their marriage, she knew that. And now, here was the proof. The papers were the final confirmation that what she had done could never be undone. "I never wanted this." "Please," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips as she reached for the papers. Her fingers trembled as she touched the edge of the document, knowing that this moment was irreversible. There was no turning back. The weight of what was happening felt almost unbearable, suffocating her in the silence between them. Mark didn't look at her as he waited for her to sign. He just sat there, his gaze fixed on the table, as though everything he had once cared about had already been signed away, long before this moment. His stoic demeanor only made her feel more isolated, more desperate. How had it come to this? How had they gone from being partners, friends, lovers to this point of no return? As the pen hovered over the papers, Julianne's mind flashed through the years they had spent together, the good times, the laughter, the love they had shared. She remembered when they first met, the chemistry that had sparked between them. She remembered their wedding day, the promises they had made to each other. And now, those promises felt like distant memories. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper filled the room as Julianne signed the divorce papers, her heart breaking with each stroke. She felt like she was signing away a piece of herself, but at the same time she knew it was something she deserved. She had lost him. She had lost them. When she finished, she placed the pen down on the table, her hands shaking. She looked up at Mark, searching for some sign of the man she once knew, but there was nothing. His expression remained unchanged, the distance between them widening with every passing second. It was over, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The finality of it all hit Julianne like a wave. As she sat there, staring at the signed divorce papers, the office around her seemed to close in, the walls growing tighter with each breath she took. She had hoped, prayed that somehow, somewhere, there would be a way to salvage this. That Mark might reach out to her, maybe even take back what he had done. But he hadn't. There was no comfort in the office, no warmth, no hope left. All she could feel was the crushing weight of her decisions. She had betrayed the man she had once promised to love and cherish, and now he was walking away without a second glance. It was clear to her that the marriage had ended long before today's meeting. The affair, the lies, the emotional distance, they had all led to this inevitable conclusion. She had pushed him too far, and he had finally decided he couldn't take it anymore. Mark stood up slowly, his chair scraping across the floor with a dull noise that seemed to echo in Julianne's chest. He didn't look at her as he gathered his things. She sat frozen in place, her mind numb, her thoughts scattered. She wanted to say something, anything, to make him stay, to make him understand the depth of her regret, but she knew it was pointless. She had no right to ask for anything more from him. "Goodbye," Julianne, Mark said quietly, his voice distant, almost mechanical. There was no emotion in it, just a simple statement, as if he were leaving a room, not a life. And with that he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Julianne alone with the wreckage of their marriage. For a long moment she didn't move. She just sat there, staring at the door through which Mark had exited, her heart breaking into a million pieces. She had destroyed everything she had once held dear: her marriage, her family, her future. She had let her selfish desires lead her down a path of betrayal, and now she was paying the price. Julianne wiped her eyes, trying to steady her breath as the tears fell freely now. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her. She had lost him. She had lost herself in the process. The life she had known was gone. And now all that was left was the painful reality of facing the consequences of her actions. As she gathered her things and made her way to the door, she couldn't help but wonder what her life would look like now. What was left for her? She had no answers, only regret. Stepping out of the office, Julianne took one last look behind her before walking into the unknown, the weight of her choices following her every step. The cool air outside the lawyer's office did little to ease the storm of emotions brewing inside Julianne. As she stepped into the parking lot, her legs felt heavy, as though the weight of her decisions was physically dragging her down. She took a few shaky steps, her thoughts spiraling in a chaotic whirlwind. Every part of her was screaming for this to not be the reality, yet it was undeniable. Her heart ached with an emptiness she hadn't expected to feel, especially after everything that had transpired. The affair had seemed so simple when it first began. A distraction, a way to fill the void she thought was only temporary. She had never imagined it would come to this. The divorce papers were only the beginning of the emotional toll it would take on her. She had torn apart the life she once knew, and now she was left with nothing but guilt and regret. Julianne couldn't remember the last time she had truly been happy. The marriage to Dave had been full of passion in the beginning, but somewhere along the way, they had lost themselves, lost each other. She had tried to explain it all in the lawyer's office, but the truth was, her words had no power anymore. The recordings, the proof of her betrayal, had erased any chance of convincing Dave to stay. The damage was irreversible, and she knew it deep down. Her mind kept going back to Jason, the younger man who had become her escape. At the time, he had seemed so different from Dave, so spontaneous and full of life. But now, as she thought about it, Julianne realized that Jason had just been a substitute for something deeper. She hadn't been seeking him out for love or affection. She had been running away from the loneliness and frustration she felt in her marriage. She had ignored the red flags, convinced herself that she was justified in her actions, but now that justification felt hollow and meaningless. Walking aimlessly through the parking lot, Julianne's hands trembled, and she found herself leaning against her car, her forehead pressed to the cool metal. Her breath was shaky as she tried to gather her thoughts, but there was no escaping the crushing reality. She was alone. She had pushed everyone away with her selfishness. She had betrayed the one person who had loved her unconditionally, and now she had no one left to turn to. She tried to convince herself that there would be a way to move forward, that she would find healing eventually. But deep down, Julianne knew that her life would never be the same. The divorce was just the first chapter of a new reality, one she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Her world felt shattered, her self-worth diminished, and she didn't know how to start rebuilding it. As Julianne drove home, the streets seemed to blur around her focus solely on the heavy weight in her chest. The divorce papers, signed and filed, felt like a final nail in the coffin of everything she had once held dear. What had she done? Was there any way to fix the wreckage she had caused? Her thoughts were clouded with regret, guilt, and shame, emotions that threatened to swallow her whole. The quiet in her car contrasted sharply with the tumult of her inner turmoil. She had spent so long pretending that everything was fine, ignoring the cracks in her marriage and in herself. Now, with the divorce behind her, she was left to confront the truth. She had been selfish. She had allowed herself to believe that the affair was an escape, but all it had done was leave her more lost and more alone than ever before. When Julianne arrived home, the house felt empty. It was strange. It was the same house she had shared with Dave for years, yet it felt like a stranger's place now. She walked through the rooms, touching familiar objects, but they no longer held the same comfort. Everything reminded her of what she had lost, what she had given up in her pursuit of something fleeting. Her mind kept returning to Dave. She remembered their first date, the way he had looked at her, the way she had felt so loved and cherished. He had been her rock, her confidant, the person she thought she could always count on. But somewhere along the way, she had stopped appreciating him, stopped valuing their bond. She had sought attention from another man, thinking it would fix something inside her, when all it had done was destroy everything she had built with Dave. As she sat on the couch, staring at the empty space in front of her, Julianne realized just how much she had lost. Not just her marriage, but her sense of self. She had allowed her insecurities to guide her actions, and now she was paying the price. She had pushed Dave away, and in doing so, she had lost the love and support that had once been her foundation. The silence in the house was deafening. There was no one to talk to, no one to confide in. Julianne knew that her journey of healing would be long, and she didn't even know where to begin. But one thing was certain: she would have to face the consequences of her actions every single day from here on out. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was the one she had chosen. As she closed her eyes, tears silently streaming down her face, she couldn't help but think about what could have been. But it was too late for that now. The life she had known was gone, and all that was left was the painful truth of her choices. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more compelling stories like this one.